Hey guys, and welcome to one more episode of Builder Nation. For today's agenda, we have Diana Siegel, CFO at Electra Aero, a new aerospace company developing and manufacturing hybrid electric aircraft.
Thanks so much for having me, Eliza. And I'm really looking forward to talk all sorts of things, electric aircraft and any other topics we might want to get into.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so before we start, why don't we let our main guest introduce herself? Maybe Diana, if you can please share a little bit about you, about your experience. I know that you are actually an engineer and then you jumped into business. So maybe share a little bit about that part of the story.
Will do, absolutely. So as mentioned, I'm Diana Siegel, the CFO for Electra Aero, and we are a sustainable aircraft company. So we build aircraft to ultimately help decarbonize air transportation. And the first product we're developing is a 9-seat hybrid electric ultra-short takeoff and landing aircraft. And ultra-short basically meaning that you can take off and land in a really short distance. So we're talking 90 by 30 meters, so comparable to the size of a soccer field. And the idea is really that you could provide high-speed air mobility services without relying on traditional airport infrastructure. So you can imagine going from a barge in a river to a converted parking lot directly from city center to city center. So you could cut down a trip from New York to Washington, D.C. that right now takes 4 hours, regardless of whether you drive or fly, right? You could cut that down to a little more than an hour. So we're really after addressing that regional mobility space where it just takes too long to drive. It's not worth getting to and through an airport to fly on a commercial aircraft yet. And we just view this as a huge opportunity where there's not a good ground transportation or alternate transportation solution yet. And the way I personally got involved with this is, as you mentioned, I'm an engineer by training, did electrical and aerospace engineering. Actually then worked as an aerospace engineer for a few years, but then got out of the industry because it felt like a pretty slow industry at the time. There wasn't a lot of innovation happening. It felt like we built the same tube and wing aircraft over and over again. So I switched into business for about 4 years, worked as a management consulting for the Boston Consulting Group. Super fun, great experience, can only recommend that. Wonderful mentors. But really had this thing about aerospace engineering. That was just my passion and I loved it. And in 2015, got back in the industry when just a lot of excitement was happening around electric propulsion, flight automation, more and more autonomous aircraft. Lots of folks sort of like were pursuing startups around commercial drones. A bunch of R&D groups were really seriously pursuing designs for much more fuel efficient transport aircraft. So needless to say, got all excited about that and ended up joining the team at Aurora Flight Sciences. And Aurora is a company that's been building robotic and electric prototype type aircraft for a good 3 decades. And at Aurora, I ended up leading the commercial air mobility programs team. And among other things, we were building a 2-seat all-electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. And here the idea was really to lift off vertically from a rooftop in a city, sort of like fly all over traffic and sort of like land at an urban distance, right? A little further down the line, also vertically. And what we found when we built that prototype was that while this concept was technically doable, we found that just the performance ended up too low to make that worthwhile as an actual sort of like commercial product. And while we were working on this project, a group at MIT that we've been working with for a while knew well, they brought up this idea of an ultra short takeoff and landing aircraft. So we built a project around that, actually tested the concept, got really excited about the performance of that. And here we are, our founder and CEO ended up spinning out the company, Electra, sort of like out of Aurora. And I joined the company about 6 months later and been there sort of like ever since. Been a good 2-year journey now and very much enjoying it.
But I'm really curious because at the beginning you mentioned how, I don't know, back in the days, the industry was not like what it is right now. So what do you say has been the biggest change in the industry, in the aerospace industry, in order to, I don't know, get Electra whatever it is now?
One, from a market perspective, where folks are really demanding that aviation is doing something about its carbon footprint, right? All other sort of like industries are pushing in that direction, are doing what they can to reduce sort of like their emissions. And with air transportation, a lot of times we just throw our hands up in the air and say, it's a hard to decarbonize industry. And it is, right? But that doesn't mean we should do nothing, right? That there is great tools at our disposal right now to actually build aircraft that are much more sustainable. And one of those certainly is around electric propulsion. And electric propulsion doesn't mean all electric, right? It can mean also hybrid electric, so that you use electric power, right, to help build an aircraft that's much more energy efficient, but you still sort of like use a liquid fuel source, right, to get the range that and payload that the industry needs. So that's certainly a thing that has changed, that electric propulsion now got powerful enough and capable enough that we could consider it for use in aviation, and also flight automation and autonomy, right? Like those two elements that came over from frankly, the electronics industry, sort of like from robotics, from the automotive industry, that now lets us build aircraft that first sort of like are a lot safer, put a less burden on the pilots, or at least they should. Sometimes that doesn't work out fully, right? But that is the intent. And let us start thinking about sort of like, how do we get to more dense operations and also more safe operations that also let us consider flying aircraft in cities, and not just sort of like a very large sort of like spacing out to airports that we've sort of moved away, right, from where people live, and actually shoved them out sort of like into the outskirts of the city, where it's just a long trip to get to and through.
I know that you recently partnered up with NASA and you worked together for a campaign. So what was that experience like? Or I'm pretty sure that you guys were all excited at the beginning, right?
Oh, absolutely. And partnerships are really key to our strategy, because going back to what we just talked about, right, it's really difficult for a startup to try and do everything, right? You want to focus on the small piece that you do best to start, right? And you can build from there, and basically work with partners to bring in the elements that they do best. And for example, the key sort of like partnerships on our end are obviously sort of like we work with fantastic suppliers and provider of hardware systems, be that engines, be that avionics, be that batteries, right, that provide those elements into the aircraft. And then also work with fantastic partners on the aircraft operations side that basically have a really deep understanding of the transportation problems in their specific sort of like region of the world. For example, we're working with Bristow Helicopters that right now sort of is, they're one of the largest helicopter operators in the world right now, very much focused on the oil and gas industry, but really looking to diversify into new markets from their cargo logistics, regional air mobility. And it's fantastic to work with such forward-looking and just really experts sort of like in their fields to get the aircraft fielded. And working with NASA obviously is fantastic. They've built the entire sort of like national campaign, is what the program's called, around really showcasing how advanced air mobility aircraft could operate in the future, right? Like what also the rest of the ecosystem would need to look like, be that infrastructure, communications, navigation equipment, right? All of that will need to come together at the end to really fulfill that promise, right, of hopping from city center to city center, or from rooftop to rooftop, like our colleagues that are building vertical takeoff and landing aircraft are pursuing. So it's an exciting time to be in the space.
Congratulations on that. Yeah, you mentioned Bristol. I know that you guys are with Flapper as well in Latin America, Skyports in Australia. So you guys are kind of like all over the world?
So Bristol was our launch customer in our sort of like home base, if you will, in the US. Very shortly, sort of like after linked up with Paul Militsky from Flapper, who's doing just a fantastic job, sort of like building an on-demand air mobility platform in Latin America, and is extremely sort of like forward-looking in what sustainable sort of like an advanced air mobility could look like. So the true joy sort of like working with Paul and also folks in Australia and the rest of the world that we have recently announced. And yeah, that made for a bunch of sleepless nights on my end as well, right? Sort of like hopping time zones. every day sort of like of the week, but just truly enjoyable sort of like to work with those kind of folks that are so passionate about driving this industry forward and really getting the aircraft sort of like out into the real world, right, and doing real operations down the line.
Diana, and I can totally see that passion. I mean, guys, you didn't see the call or you didn't hear the call before we actually started recording, but Diana was like, yes, it's like almost nighttime in here and I have all the attitude. So Diana, thank you so much for joining once again. And I mean, I was actually reading an article about an interview of yours, and it was really interesting because you mentioned that Electra, it's not like necessarily like looking forward to operating the aircraft, but designing it. So did you initially start Electra with that focus of designing, certifying, and building aircraft instead of operating? Or do you think that, I don't know, in the next upcoming months or years, that's going to be a focus as well?
No, great question, because we've been tossing that back and forth as well, right? Considering sort of like which business model to go for, and very practically sort of like settled on, designing, building, and certifying an aircraft is probably enough sort of like to chew down in one go, right, for any company. So let's start there, right, and work sort of like with partners that are really experienced, A, sort of like in operating aircraft safely, and then B, we really can't claim that we're the experts sort of like of transportation problems worldwide, right? Like there's folks sort of like that really know this better, sort of that are sort of like very local in their region and bring in that experience. And then we work with the partners to the extent that they like and need, right, to set up the overall sort of like project, right, that would really then see aircraft flying, I don't know, between sort of be that sort of like Washington, D.C. and New York, right? Or I don't know, over here in Switzerland, I'm continuously frustrated about the trip from Lugano to Geneva that really should only take you about an hour, but it's 6 hours going around a mountain. so realizing those projects that we work with local operators, and that may see us take on more or less sort of like of a role, really depending on how that partnership and that setup plays out. And I don't think there's one specific model. So I wouldn't rule out sort of like that we might move a little more sort of like into the operations where the partner sort of like sees value in that.
Well, Diana, I found so interesting the fact that you are also an engineer, but you're working on the business side and the operation side. So you're kind of like in between both roles.
Oh, it's so hard to say. I really actually love doing both. Sort of like, and maybe, right, as you say, that intersection, right, where you use your engineering training basically to gauge, well, what makes sense, sort of like what's actually feasible to do, right, and thinking about how something that we could build on the engineering side could, at the end of the day, impact sort of like how we live, move, right, how we deal with transportation is just wonderful, right, because you feel like there's just a lot of impact, right, that you can have at that point, and you really see it every day as we're talking with potential customers.
Oh, I'm glad to see that passion of yours. And one of the last questions, last but not least, the first one, it will be, what will you say it has been the biggest, I don't want to say technical challenge, because you're mostly on the operations and business side? On
the business side, I would probably say, as part of working for BCG, I worked actually for their digital ventures arm for a while, and we built software apps there for sort of exploring very quickly sort of like startup ideas and new products. And it was just amazing. Like within 3 months, right, you could field a software, an app sort of like as a prototype, right? See it out there in the wild, see how people react to it, right? You just put it out to a small number of users for a limited time, but you immediately sort of like get feedback and can kind of use that, right, to refine your product and improve it. With a hardware startup, and then particularly with an aviation startup, right, where we got this long product development cycles, lots of capital required, and you really can't field a product that's not certified, right? We cannot carry passengers unless sort of like it's proven to be safe and certified. We don't get that quick feedback loop from actually fielding a product, right? So therefore, you need to work your way sort of like through that process with early prototypes, show and tell sort of like of digital mock-ups, right? And show people sort of like virtually, right, what this could be down the line, sort of like without them without you actually being able to pull up a demo, right? And say, why don't you click in and try sort of like if you like this. So I miss that about the software
The
world.
dream.
Exactly. But at the same time, right, it's just so impactful what we're able to do with an aviation sort of like hardware startup. And the 9th seat is at the start, right? Like what also gets us excited is where could this go down the line, right? Because the technologies that we're building here, hybrid electric propulsion, how you really integrate aerodynamic and propulsive effects much more, so that you can get higher energy efficiency out of the aircraft. That's applicable also to the larger transport class aircraft. And I'm really curious to see sort of like how the next generation of transport aircraft would look like, right? That you and I could fly on when we take a trip sort of like across the Atlantic, or I don't know, sort of like a cross-country trip kind of thing.
I think it's going to be sooner than you expect, honestly. I mean, the industry is moving so fast, and especially in the last, I don't know, couple of years since the company started, you can see the change. You have seen the change. So I'm super happy to hear that you're super excited. And well, thank you so much for sharing these experiences and all of your story, Diana. Do you have any last advice for future entrepreneurs?
Yeah, no, a great question. Maybe let me start with sort of startup advice, right? Like because we keep reminding ourselves of that as well, right? But we all want, it's really important to have this big vision, right, of what it is sort of like that we could ultimately do, right? And that's what all gets us excited. But then sort of like narrowing it down, right, to the smallest thing, right, that we could start building now, right? And really prioritizing our efforts around sort of like, and focus the entire team on it. That's sort of like we found really important, because it's so easy to get distracted, right? And you just never have enough sort of like time and money to do all the things sort of like that you really want to do. So as a startup, if you do one thing, right, big vision, but then narrow it down quickly, right, to focus on this first small thing that you can build, get traction with customers, and show investors that you're able to deliver, right, on what it is you're doing. And honestly, sort of like for girls, sort of like, and women in general, sort of like in I think engineering sort of like has just been this it seems counterintuitive, but I always found sort of like it is just a fantastic career to where it just matters sort of like less, right? Like that, whether you're male sort of like or female sort of like, if you're just applying yourself, you're excited about it. Because at the end of the day, it's an industry sort of like where data sort of like how you present that, sort of like how you build the facts around it sort of like matter probably a lot more sort of like than having sort of like a typical sort of alpha male type demeanor sort of like to you, right? Which to female sort of like just feels foreign to exert that a lot, right? So therefore we feel much more comfortable if we can basically just back it up with analysis, data, and facts. And engineering sort of like is an industry that rewards that, right? And will not put sort of like any blocking items sort of like in your way as you sort of like progress through your career. So I can only recommend it. And I've had wonderful sort of like mentors and advisors, sort of like male, female, right, sort of like growing up through that industry. And I can only recommend it. It's a fantastic industry to be in.
Wow, so inspiring. Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing your experiences or sharing your advices. Do you have any social media handles? Where can people find you? Where can people follow you or follow Electra?
Yeah, so Electra, we're visit us on our website, right? Electra.aero, that's with a C, and then AERO. And feel free sort of like to reach out on LinkedIn. You can find me under Diana Siegel and Electra Aero, or just email me siegel.diana@electra.aero if you want to chat more.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And remember, guys, that you can also find more interesting articles, interesting interviews, just like this one with Diana, at our website, controlhub.com/builder-nature. We will love to hear from you. And once again, Diana, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time. And hopefully we will get to connect soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Eliza. It's been super fun.